Thank you and welcome. I get the honor of giving the sponsored talk, which is to say, I'm from Oracle. I run the Java group there. I'm also the chair of the OpenJDK governing board. And we are so pleased to be doing this conference again. It was not much fun those few years when we didn't get to have it, and it was tremendously fun last year when we had, I think, pretty healthy attendance for not having done it for a while. But I'm super pleased to see so many people here today. We have a really full room, basically, I think, filling in there in the back, so welcome. I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to say a couple of words to hopefully set the stage a little bit. So in order to set the stage, it's always useful to kind of look at where we've come from. And I would say, one of the things that really sort of typifies my group and that I really love about everyone in the group is there's a sort of constant desire to improve and a healthy amount of dissatisfaction with where we are in pursuit of continually getting better. But sometimes when that's the way you think about the world, it's very easy to sort of lose perspective in how far we've come. So I think it's kind of useful to look back a little bit. We're going to look back at the bad old days. So what do I mean by the bad old days? Well, I guess more than, let's say, 6 or so years ago when we used to release Java in a very kind of almost haphazard way, major releases every few years. These releases were typified by being feature-bound rather than time-bound. And so what that meant was, you were looking out, 3 or 4 years into the future and trying to predict what the world was going to need and how long it was going to take for you to build that at the level of quality that we all expect of the JDK. And that's a really hard thing to do. It was frequently something that we didn't successfully do, and the result was, well, we got to choose. Are we going to ship something that's not good enough quality? No, that's no good. No, we're going to delay until it's right. And that's really tough. It's tough for people who are working on the JDK. It's also very tough for those who want to consume it. It made it tough for enterprises or organizations that wanted to move to a new version of Java to know what to expect and when to test it. And in large part, it wasn't just because they were waiting for us, but because they were waiting for an entire ecosystem to adapt to new things. And because these releases were so far in between, they had lots and lots of stuff in them. And that didn't necessarily make things easier. In fact, one of the things I used to joke about is we had the marbles backed up behind basketballs problem, right? Where you've got a couple of big features, they take a really long time to do, and even the small, easy things you couldn't get out into the hands of developers because those big things had to be done before you could get there. So, this was not a great situation. The sort of release every few years also made people very tempted to say, well, it's going to be a few years or it's going to be a long time until this thing gets out. So, my feature that's not quite ready, I'm just going to push it in. Because, if I don't get it in now, it's going to be like 5 years till anyone can use it. And I want people to use it. But that means you got all of these features that are coming in, kind of maybe not half-baked, maybe let's say 3/4 baked, okay, maybe 90% baked. But that's a bunch of baking left to be done. And so that caused a lot of challenges, as you can see here. So we decided, pretty early on, probably about 10 years ago, that we wanted to do something about this. We wanted to make a change to this situation in order to make the JDK something that could be more reliably evolving. And so we thought a lot about how to go about doing that. And we talked with a lot of people. We talked with a number of the people in this room. And we talked with people who were using Java, and we talked with people who are working on libraries or frameworks. And what we found was that the sort of desire that people had really kind of broke down into a couple of different camps. There were developers who for the most part were like, yeah, give me new features, give them to me fast, give them to me all the time. As soon as it's ready, I want it. And there were enterprises who were like, everything's perfect now. Don't ever change anything. It's good enough. And then, we thought that was all really interesting, right? Like, it's good enough. What do you mean? So we would ask them, okay, well, what are you writing your next project in? And they would go, oh, Node. Okay, so it wasn't good enough, right? And what they meant when they said it was good enough was basically, we're afraid of change, right? We just don't want anything to change. We want security updates, but like we don't want to have to do any work. Okay. Basically, what we came up with was the idea of shipping often. I think you're all probably familiar with this, the 6-month cadence. In fact, that now seems fairly obvious. I can tell you at the time it was definitely not obvious. It was controversial. But basically, in order to satisfy the sort of enterprise side of the house, we said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to do new releases frequently, but we're not going to force the things we're doing in the new releases on people who really just want stability. And so that's why we started this idea of the LTS. We weren't the ones to come up with this. Obviously, it's an idea that has been prevalent in the industry, but it was kind of new to the JDK. So what we found when we started to do that was really kind of interesting. But basically, to start out, when we sort of suggested this idea, and in particular 6 months, which is, it was a pretty radical departure at the time, there was a lot of skepticism. People were like, oh my God, what are you talking about? You guys are nuts. A lot of the biggest critics were actually people on my team who were working on the JDK. And were like, I don't know how we're going to do this. Like, they saw all of the things that were going to be challenges or problems. They knew we had never done things at that pace before. They saw practical impediments. They saw technical impediments. But all of those impediments, at the end of the day, essentially came down to, this is different. It's scary. We're comfortable doing it the way we have been. I don't know, do we really want to try to do this, and what will happen if we fail? Now, the people on the team were skeptical, but I would say people in the broader ecosystem were at least, if not more, skeptical. There were all the folks who were already saying, hey, Java 8 is all we'll ever need, don't ever change. But there were people who said, gosh, we're going to have all these releases, we're just going to get overwhelmed, there's no way we can keep up. There's no way you guys can keep up. You're not going to be able to keep shipping things at the quality that we expect. But again, all of that came down to just kind of being afraid of something different. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of choice quotes from people at the time. I think at least one of these people is in the room here somewhere. You can understand, right, why this was sort of the sentiment at the time. I think these are quite funny, especially if you look at them now. All right, well, let's go on. So if that was the sentiment at the time, there were definitely things that we needed to do. Right, this was not a gimme. It wasn't easy, and as engineers, the things that were most obvious to us as challenges were technical. Oh, our testing isn't really done in a way that's going to work for this. Oh, our infrastructure doesn't really work for this. Gosh, we got a lot of code complexity here and things that need to be cleaned up. There were just a ton of things that we knew we were going to need to do that were of a technical nature. And so, that was sort of the obvious place to dig in and, pardon me, and get working. But it turned out that, like so many problems in our industry, the real challenge was not technical. It was actually a people problem, right? Everyone was used to working in a certain way, comfortable with working in a certain way, knew the sort of idiosyncrasies of what that meant, and actually changing the way that we go about working is often a harder thing than changing a tool or a build system or something in a code repo. And so there was a lot to be learned here. I think one of the things that we needed to learn was, hey, rather than sort of saying it's going to be 2 years until this thing is released, so I can check in something that's not quite ready and it will stabilize over time, actually improving our testing to the point where we could be really confident that when we check something in, it's really ready to go when it comes into the main line. That was tough. but we managed to do that over time. I think the second thing was this notion of, if my feature doesn't come into this release, it's a catastrophe because it's going to be years until anyone can use it. Well, gosh, if it's only 6 months until the next release, and you have a short stabilization period, then missing this train is really not that bad. And maybe I'd rather be the first one on the next train rather than the last one, like squeeching through the doors as the train's pulling away from the station. Breaking features down into smaller chunks, right? This is a, it sounds easy. It's of course extremely difficult to do in practice. But I think if you look at the projects that have been going on in the last 5 years, this is exactly what has started to happen. Is, even in the things that look insurmountable, that look like it all needs to come in one giant chunk, people have been able to find ways of breaking those things down and having smaller increments that are delivered over time with the benefits that come from that, right? That we learn a lot from those deliveries. We've also found new ways to deliver things, for instance, with preview features that take advantage of the fact that we're making frequent deliveries so that we can learn and adjust before things are really set in concrete. I think that one of the neat things that we really hadn't appreciated but have found has been a tremendous boon. I've called it here right-sizing the release management process. And what I mean by that is when you're doing everything, every release, every year in sort of the same time frame, the same cadence, you can get a lot better at how you do it. And you don't have to have these, emergency replanning meetings because, this release was moved out 3 months and that throws off the entire release schedule, not only for this JDK version, but for every update of every release that is ongoing at the same time. I think what we've found as a result has been that the engineers, at least on my team, spend a lot less time in meetings describing what they're doing or why things need to be delivered in a particular way, and actually more time working on solving those problems, designing, implementing the features, et cetera. And I think that's been something that people really, really appreciate. So yeah, so what is the result? I think we found that it's worked really well. We found that we actually underappreciated the extent to which the way that we do backports and the choices made around backports could evolve. I think in the past we used to sort of think, well, this particular fix might be good for someone, so we might as well backport it. And there was a lot of very enthusiastic backporting. The irony of that is that most of the people who want to use a stable release want to use a stable release. Like, they don't necessarily thank you for backporting something that they don't perceive that they want or need. And if they do perceive that they want or need it, then they have a choice to try to move forward to a release that has it. So that's actually worked, I think, surprisingly well and turned out to be a lot less effort and work on an ongoing basis than we thought, while delivering something that's really more what the customers of that particular release want. So that's been pretty neat. I think at this point, when we look at those sort of two groups of folks out there that consume the JDK, developers are pretty happy with this, right? They basically feel that they're getting new features on a much more rapid cadence and are able to learn about them and start to use them over time. Enterprises are actually getting more what they wanted, right? They're getting these really, really stable update releases that they know with high confidence they can apply without issues. JDK developers, folks, both on my team and in the broader community outside of Oracle, get to spend more time developing and less time sitting in meetings. And I will say, this is always like super, I've got like major wood I need to be knocking on here. Every release that we've done in the 6-month cadence has been delivered on time, as planned. And that, just that is amazing, right? But it's not amazing just because, gosh, we get to pat ourselves on the back for delivering on time. It's amazing because it means that the people who are using the JDK now believe they have something that they can trust. Like if we say it's going to be delivered at this time, it's going to be delivered at that time. Gosh, I should probably try the EAs and give feedback now. And that, believe it or not, was a challenge in the past. Some of you may have remembered JDK 7, if not, catch me in the hallway. All right. So what do people say about this? This is from, I think, a little while ago. But it's a pretty stark difference from what we saw prior to moving to this model. I don't know about you, but like when I see people saying like this change is the best thing that's happened to the JDK, you know, that's super, super heartening. It's really amazing to see. And so everyone is now happy, right? All right, down there on the bottom right, wake me up when we get to Valhalla. Okay. Well, hopefully, we can wake up soon. All right. Okay, so this is, you know, just a sort of pictorial representation of what it looks like now. I think you're all very familiar with this. I won't belabor it. In fact, the "you are here" is not where you are. I should have moved that arrow, sorry, but there we go. So next, I just want to cover this a little bit because, you know, I've been talking now about a change that we made to the JDK and how we develop it and how we deliver it. But I think that was a good first step. It was a necessary step. But we're not completely there yet. So I want to mention this, and I've got a hat tip here to Brian. These slides came out of work that we did, kind of throwing the ball back and forth and thinking about stuff. So basically, seatbelts, right? Seatbelts. Okay, well, you know, look. When I was a kid, decades ago, you know, seatbelts were this sort of annoying thing that you had to put on, and your parents were always nagging you and whatever, right? And when they first came out and were introduced, a lot of people were like, what is this? This is pain. I don't want to have to do this. But, you know, like 20, 30 years later on, like nobody debates this, right? Seatbelts are obvious. You get in the car, you put on your seatbelt. We see the data. We understand that they save lives. The fact that we have seatbelts has meant that, you know, like they've raised the, you know, speed limits on freeways, and still we're safer than we were before. So, you know, this is kind of cool, right? So when we released JDK 9, we had the module system, the Java module system, and we said at the time that the Java module system is seatbelts, not jetpacks. And of course, you know, people were like, jetpacks? What's the guy talking about jetpacks, right? Like, I don't see any jetpacks here. I just see seatbelts, and they're annoying. And so they were very annoyed by the module system. But what we meant was, there are a bunch of things that were kind of holding us back from more rapid evolution, and more importantly, people's ability to move their applications to newer versions of Java and take advantage of that evolution because there weren't good enough seatbelts. And so what do I mean by that? Well, you know, there were a lot of things in Java early on that made it very flexible, very powerful. You could reach into other places and start to use stuff that perhaps the authors of that stuff never really meant for you to use. And, you know, then you got kind of stuck. We're going to see an example in a minute. I think the nice thing is that now, a few years later on, when we've had evolution, when we've had a lot of features delivered, when we're seeing the things that are on the cusp of being delivered, we understand that there are jetpacks, right? There are jetpacks. We can use them today. There are more jetpacks coming. But in order for people practically to be able to take advantage of those jetpacks, we needed to have the seatbelts in place. So let's look at what I mean by this. And by the way, you know, a lot of people kind of look at this and they're like, well, you know, what are you talking about? My code is great. I've never done any of those horrible, horrible things you're talking about. They're horrible. I would never do that, right? But most applications out there, and this is, by the way, a strength of Java and the Java ecosystem, use, you know, third-party dependencies, right? There are great libraries out there they can take advantage of. And, you know, they might look at it and go, well, you know, I only have 4 dependencies, right? Like, how bad could this be? But each of those dependencies might, in turn, have a number of dependencies. And in fact, some of them may have the same dependencies, and some of them may have different versions of the same dependencies. And, you know, quite quickly you find out that you weren't dependent on 4 things. You were dependent on 25. And you know, like a lot of those are probably keeping up. Their maintainers are like doing a great job and they're ready to go. They're not holding you back from moving forward. But all it takes is one of those not being ready for you to end up being stuck. And again, it might not be the thing you're looking at and going, I'm using this thing, it looks like it's all good. It may be something that's sort of several layers down, but it's still a problem for you if you want to move forward and use Jetpacks. So, okay, yeah, I like the emoji up there. Basically, I think that the sort of crazy thing about this is, like, to sort of, you know, put this in perspective, this is a luxury problem in some sense, right? As long as the JDK wasn't moving quickly, no one really cared about this problem. Now that we're moving more quickly, now that we have more features coming out and features that people really want to take advantage of, it's now a challenge. And so basically what we need to do is, you know, and I don't bring this up like as something that like it's the fault of particular people in this room. I think this is something that is a challenge for all of us together to try to solve and to try to encourage our colleagues who do wonderful, admirable work on third-party libraries and frameworks to help solve. And so what I mean by that is I think that, and I'm also not, you know, I don't want to suggest that it's trivial. We'll get to that in a sec. But, you know, basically, I think this is something where, if we're not careful, this advantage of the Java ecosystem, that there's this rich set of libraries and tools, actually could be something that people start to view as a problem and a challenge. And, you know, we've certainly seen other ecosystems where there are lots of tools, but people don't necessarily consider that to be a good thing. You know, we want that to stay a good thing for Java. So what can we possibly do? Well, I think one of the things that we could consider doing is taking a book out of what we've learned and what I was talking about earlier with the model that we moved to for updating and releasing the JDK, and consider whether libraries and frameworks could keep along with that. So basically, rather than saying, every time I do a new version of my library, it's got to work on 3 different JDK versions back to 2014 or 2017 or 2019 for that matter, I'm going to say the new things are for the people who want the new things. My new version is going to work on the latest JDK, right? I'm going to keep up with the latest JDK. And for the people who want something older, maybe I'll do an LTS version. It doesn't have the new features. It basically is just something to keep people who are content in being on an older version secure. And so, you know, this is something that I've gone around and spoken with a lot of library maintainers on. The funny thing, you're going to love this. So when I like stand in front of a room like this and say this kind of thing, you know, I'll often ask, like, how many people, you know, view themselves as somebody who's responsible for a third-party library that's you know, out there and being used? And there's always a few people who raise their hand. And I generally go and speak with them afterwards and say, well, you know, what did you think? Do you think this was crazy? Do you think it was a good idea? And almost to one, what they say is, this is a fabulous idea. This is exactly how we should be doing things. And I'm like, great, so you're going to go back and do that. Oh, no, you see, it's not me. It's all the other people working on my library that don't want to do this, right? So, you know, there's clearly a lot of skepticism to it. I think the skepticism comes from a very honest place. It's the same honest place where the skepticism that you saw earlier in this presentation came from, right? Nobody's not doing this because, you know, they think it's necessarily good. It's because it's scary to do it differently. And what will my users think? And, you know, when I do a new version that's got new stuff in it, I've got to bring it to the maximum people possible, and the maximum people are using an older version. But they don't necessarily thank you for putting new features in their way. They may be perfectly happy with what they're using right now. And if they're not, knowing that they can move forward to a new version that also gives them other advantages, but do that when it works for them, and choosing to do it rather than having it foisted upon them, could actually be a really, really positive alternative. So yeah, there we go. I guess one other area of skepticism comes from the fear that this will be a tremendous amount of work. Yeah, I could do that, but gosh, then I've got different forks, and if I'm doing that, like, I'm going to have to backport all this stuff. you just might find that you don't have to backport as much as you thought, and that people don't actually thank you for backporting so much stuff. I don't want to suggest this is one size fits all. Obviously, there are different kinds of libraries and the challenges may be different, but I do think that this is an alternative that more libraries should consider. And I think that if people do consider that, if we got, it's always hard to get a few first movers, but I think the more examples we see of people doing this, the more others are going to find it acceptable to do as well. And ultimately, what I really hope we get to is something where when a new version of the JDK comes out, all the libraries you want to use have new versions that come out basically at the same time. Maybe those have new features, but also that the long-term support releases for the JDK have long-term support for the libraries that people find important. And I think that would be a really, really positive place for the Java ecosystem to land. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. By all means, come and talk to me in the next couple of days and share your ideas with me about this. If I miss something, definitely let me know. And if you think there's merit in this, please help me help library maintainers get to this point. All right, thank you. So I did have one other thing. I told you this is a sponsored talk, and so I just have to mention Oracle is hiring for the JDK and the JVM team. So please, if that is your area of interest, do talk to us. All right, thanks everyone.